I'm Iona Fyfe and this is Max Thomson.
Hello.
We have been partnered together as part of Talk, Play, Collaborate, a project by Dumfries Music Conference.
Yeah. And we've been partnered together to create a song together, a song that kind of deals with the question that we both answered when applying ourselves to Talk, Play, Collaborate. And that question was to do with the impact of Brexit on musicians today. So, Iona, I wonder if you can tell me what the impact of Brexit has had on your career.
Okay, well, to begin with, I think when we were doing the whole creative thing, it was really difficult to write a song about the constitutional issue of Brexit, because all the song would be is, we don't want to have carnies, we don't want to fill out visas. It would be like a we hate admin song. So we have kind of recontextualised that, which is cool, and we've taken the whole Brexit issue and placed it into a more personal and more profound topic of the UK's hostile immigration policy, which we have seen in Glasgow over the last month or so.
Absolutely. And something that Brexit has certainly accelerated is this anti-immigrant sentiment that now kind of fosters its way within the higher parts of the United Kingdom government. And for us in Glasgow, it's one of these issues that very recently we have had to deal with as a city. Where on Kenmure Street we had the Home Office coming in vans to deport people on a particularly sensitive day as well. And I think it was felt across the city, the outrage towards that kind of action being taken.
And I think as a folk musician, a lot of what I do is songs that have a narrative, a meaning, a story, and it's usually in chronological order, these ballads that are really old, and sometimes they're quite, far-fetched. Some of them don't have any meaning in the 21st century, which is why when I looked to try and get inspiration for this, a song called Deportees came up, which you'll see very shortly, and I heard this song from Robin Oakes, who is a prominent trade unionist and amazing musician who's had a long and storied career, working with lots of musicians like Barbara Dixon and Jerry Rafferty, and I got to sing this with him a few years ago at the Nelson Mandela Memorial Day at Glasgow City Chambers, and it was just a song that I thought, whoa, this resonates a lot with me, but then recontextualising it and placing it within Kenmure Street was really interesting. And I've never co-written a song before, and tell us about the process.
Yeah, it's been a really fruitful process, I think, for both of us, especially during the COVID pandemic and the lockdown that we've had to endure. Especially for a lot of musicians, that has meant that the career has really, been stalled for the year. With live gigs and festivals being cancelled across the UK, and a lot of our income and our hobby and our love and our career has sort of been destroyed. And to kind of refine that again in a collaborative effort, it's definitely been very fruitful for, I think, both of us in getting ourselves back into making music. And making music together.
And I think that it's safe to say that we are both early career musicians, and early career musicians are definitely the ones that have been disproportionately affected by the restrictions put in place by Brexit. I know myself that before Brexit I spent a lot of my time touring in Austria and Germany and Switzerland and going off and doing one-off shows, so maybe doing like a run of 3 weeks, but then also managing to fly out to Bilbao in the Basque Country, do one gig and then fly home. Now, in order to do one gig in any part of Spain, it would cost around £600 for a visa, which means that I just wouldn't have gotten to do that gig. For an early career musician, that visa cost and the work permit cost is the difference between making a gig viable or not. and now the gig isn't viable.
Yeah. And so many gigs have been not viable for us in Europe, and I think especially as upcoming musicians, Europe is one of these big cultural centres that for many UK bands and Scottish acts as well, it's a real milestone in our careers to be able to say that we've been able to play internationally and to an international crowd. I certainly lost out with myself and my band as well, as we were just on the cusp of breaking into Europe. Brexit happened, and then the coronavirus pandemic happened, and now the prospect of getting into Europe is so much further away than it ever was, and that milestone has now been pushed even further back. And yeah, it's a real kicker to any musician's career, absolutely.
And it's not necessarily a case of just rescheduling a gig or a show. I found that when all of my tours got cancelled in 2020, the agents, the tour managers, the promoters were not really too sure about rescheduling. They were very tentative, they were very reluctant to reschedule because they didn't know what restrictions would be in place, what sort of what sort of work permit and visas each country would need, because unfortunately every single 27 member states have had the issue of the UK being devolved to them. So some of them decide, okay, so France has decided you can come and do a gig and we'll give you cultural extension. Spain has decided no, you have to get the visa, you have to get the passport, you have to get the work permit, which means that a multi-country tour, which previously would have been really frictionless and easy to do, is actually really bureaucratically difficult. And for an early career musician who doesn't have the label to front the bill, or they don't have capital to front the bill themselves, that means that the prospect of touring in Europe has been pushed further away, and I think that's really, really sad.
Absolutely, and dealing with all that red tape as well that's now in place is such a distractor from what we really do as musicians, and that is play music and practice our craft and to push our technique and become better musicians as a result. And now we're having to play both part, the musician, the agent, the promotion and our own roadies now, to be able to have any chance of getting anywhere else out of the UK. And ultimately it's the UK's music scene that suffers from this.
Yeah, so the UK is the biggest exporter of music to Europe. We contributed around 4 billion, just the music industry alone, to the UK's economy in 2019, and then in associated spending it was another 5 billion. Because when we do a gig, wherever it is, it doesn't matter if it's in the UK or if it's in Europe, people don't just come to the gig and buy a ticket. They come to the gig, they might spend money getting there on the train or in car, they might have a hotel for the night, they might go out for dinner, they might buy drinks at the bar before seeing the gig, they buy your CDs after, and then they'll go out for a drink after and then buy breakfast the next morning and then get on the train home. And it's a huge thing. Being able to put on a gig actually stimulates the local economy of wherever you're going, and I think that's really important to mind. And I think that the UK government certainly forget that when they think about the music industry. I think the main thing for me is having connection with the audience. I had my first gig in 15 months in Scotland the other day, and it just reminded me of how much connection is really important.
Absolutely.
So you can understand why I would be extremely upset to see the provisions put in place for football and for sports when those provisions are not being put in place for live music and theatre.
And careers as a result are being destroyed, and people are having to give up on their dreams and on their aspirations to be able to perform as a live musician.
The Musicians Union surveyed a group of musicians, and it found last year that 34% of musicians in the UK were considering leaving the music industry altogether. That's such a cultural loss. Imagine how many hit songs we've lost because of that. And I do think that a lot of musicians have been the same people who have fallen through the gaps in government support. The SCISS thing is coming to a close. Some people were never eligible for that in the first place. I do think that the music industry has been left behind time and time again by the UK government, and in stark contrast to the Scottish government, who created a bridging bursary hardship fund within the first 4 weeks of our national lockdown last March. The UK has certainly overlooked its most important yet undervalued cultural ambassadors.
Absolutely, and it's no wonder what with the stark difference in the way that either the Scottish government and the Westminster government have approached the issue. It's no wonder now that we see more and more young musicians moving towards the idea of a self-determining Scotland to be able to govern itself, and to be able to set out its own rules, and to be able to support the people that it protects, and the musicians and the artists and all of the workers within the creative industry.
I think Cabinet Ministers like Fiona Hislop has done an amazing job in leading us through the pandemic. Unfortunately, Fiona Hislop has stepped back, and we now have a new Culture Minister, Angus Robertson, and Junior Minister Jenny Gilruth, and that's really exciting because I believe that we're in safe hands to be taken forward and taken into consideration. We have a cross-party group on music in Scotland with lots of great organisations being represented. I feel like we're safe here, but I also feel like every single time Rishi Sunak went on TV and declared that, you know, people on furlough were getting another 6 months at 80%, and we were getting, what, 40%, 20%, it kept on going down and down and down. The idea that we still couldn't do a gig, and up until a few weeks ago, theatres and venues and music venues were operating at 2 metre distancing, yet a pub was operating at 1. So yeah, there's been huge discrepancies over how musicians have been treated, and I do think that the UK government seems to think that music equates to some unventilated grotty basement, and whilst a lot of the time in some genres that's what it is, but in other genres it can be an outdoor gig. It can be you know, in a concert hall or an arts centre or a small intimate back room of a pub. Yeah, and I do think that there's been such misconceptions.
Yeah, it doesn't take an awful lot to be able to rethink and redesign a live performance, and especially during a time of such crisis as well, where we need to be coming up with new solutions to these problems, rather than just telling everybody to stay inside for a while and just, you know, hope for the best. That's unfortunately just not enough for us.
And your band had experience with international showcasing.
Yeah.
That's really important in order to forge connections and negotiations with promoters, agents, managements, A&R from other countries. I presume that those negotiations have, albeit perhaps, fallen through.
Well, I mean, for the most part, yes. And we are still looking to get ourselves into Europe, and we're still driving for that. You know, whether it kills us, you know, we've got to get there. We've got to reach that milestone again. But absolutely, having that exposure to an international audience and to the international music scene and music business is so important for bringing more revenue into a band and to expose their music across further field.
I also think that being a folk musician and being a traditional musician, going to a folk festival in Italy or in Scandinavia or in Germany and all that, you are meeting people who are sharing their traditions, customs and cultures with you. You're playing tunes with them. It's such a small insular community, but also so universally global at the same time, that I feel like we're all part of a family, and I feel like Scotland is very much being taken out of that against our will. I mean, we did not, I mean, this is really tricky, but I have done interviews in the past with people like Victoria Derbyshire on BBC News in the morning, big high profile ones, where the elephant in the room is, you're Scottish, you have a way out. No, they didn't want to ask that though. It was all in the briefing, you know, what party does she support? Is she a Remainer? Is she a Scottish nationalist? Yeah. But that's the elephant in the room, is that we are relatively lucky that perhaps in the next 12 to 13 years, I hope that it's not that long, we have got plan B. whereas our Welsh folk musicians and our English folk musicians who identify as being English, not just folk musicians but musicians as a whole, a lot of the folk musicians that I meet at folk festivals in England are strong leftists, they're strong believers of Home Rule for Scotland, they're our allies.
Yes.
And I think a lot of people forget that this is not Scotland v England, this is Scotland versus a British establishment.
Yeah.
And it's not anti-English, that's not the case.
No.
But unlike our Welsh and English counterparts, we do have a plan B, and after the election in April we have found that there's a strong mandate for a plan B. We just unfortunately need to ask for a Section 30 to be signed. I do hope that we can tour again being Scottish independent citizens, but that seems like such a far off thing, unfortunately.
It does, it definitely does for the moment. But yeah, through self-determination we can guarantee our prospects as musicians, and we can guarantee the careers of so many creatives within this country, including those down south at DMC.
But in the interim, what do we do? That's the big question, because for me it seems like it's much easier to put a petition in for an American visa than it is for 27 European member state visas.
Mm-hmm.
That is, the tables have turned drastically, because before it was free movement in Europe, frictionless travel in Europe, not having to declare EORI numbers for your merch, not having to pay tax on your merch before you even sell it.
Mm-hmm.
And now it seems like getting a visa to go to America, to be able to tour in states that are perhaps bigger than some European countries, seems like the plan B for the interim.
And yeah, I mean it's a good thing that that's still available to us. But with the closeness of Europe and the wealth of culture that is within each European city that you go to, it still feels like such a massive loss for all of us. You know, despite there being other markets available, you know, it's not the closest market to us, and not the easiest. You know, was the easiest to access up until about a couple of years ago. So
yeah, that is true. America is not the plan B for a thing, and it is difficult to get a visa there, and it's very, very expensive for a band to do that. But I'm just thinking, like, well, if it's either 27 visas or, yeah, it all really depends. But luckily there are countries like France who have a really great track record of supporting its musicians.
yeah, cool.
Germany as well.
Germany especially, yeah.
They have supplied such amazing artist support packages over the pandemic. Same with France. Even before the pandemic, musicians in France were treated really well, like really, really well. In terms of the support that they can get from the government, cultural funding, but also, you know, wage top-ups. The fact that France valued them as cultural ambassadors so much that they would help fund not their music lifestyle, but would help support them in when they need support. But I do feel like there's this idea that perhaps this Britishness doesn't really value each individual nation's traditions. And we've seen that with sport as well.
Yeah.
We've seen Boris Johnson go, good luck to England and Scotland in the Euros and other home nations. Do you mean Wales?
Yeah.
The other home nation?
The other home nation.
So I do think that there's this like overlook, we're always being overlooked consistently, but in a world where music streaming is not actually paying musicians fairly, doing a live gig could be the difference between selling an album and making an album successful and not covering the cost of making your album, especially for early career musicians who don't have labels or representation, or labels that are useful, because that structure is changing now as well. But I think over the pandemic we've realised that our industry is reliant on in-person gatherings, and yeah, live streams are great and it's awesome to have these other opportunities via technology that is accessible to us but is not readily accessible to the entire world. We actually forget how lucky we are to have this technology.
Absolutely. And for us, when we created our track together, that technology was pretty vital for us to be able to communicate our thoughts and to collaborate together as musicians and artists. without further ado, I think it's time that we introduce our piece together.
Mm-hmm.
So this is Kenmure.
The city is quiet, the morning is breaking, the people are making their daily commute. Down in the south side they've spied a big white van. The government say they're to end a dispute over two men who settled and thrived in this nation, who made it their home and who worked all their lives. Homes on the holiest day, and judged by the press through their bigoted eyes. The suits down in Whitehall make justifications for tearing a family apart in the street. You won't have a name when you ride the big airplane. All they will call you will be Deportee. Streets, defending their neighbours, raided at dawn. For 8 hours they sat there chanting and singing, your home is in Glasgow, you're where you belong. Why should we continue to stay in this union, a union that doesn't treat us with respect? We should carve our own path and set our own rules, and value the people we ought to protect. The suits down in Whitehall make justifications for tearing a family apart in the street. You won't have a name when you ride the big airplane. All they will call you will be Deportee. Think of that woman who makes the decisions, who wears her posh suit and who smirks at the press. She thinks taking back control means deporting our people instead of the issues she ought to address. No one is illegal, no matter where they come from. We're still toiling through Westminster's lies. The system is broken, but we see a way out. It's time now for Scotland to stand up and rise. The suits down in Whitehall make justifications for tearing a family apart in the street. You won't have a name when you ride the big airplane. All they will call you will be. Is this the best way we can grow our own nation? Or can we move forward if we can agree? And they shouldn't be sent to ride the big airplane. All they will call you will be Deportee.
You probably are really aware that we're in the same room right now. This has been made possible by the fact that we have been able to have lateral flow tests that we couldn't have had back in March or February or January or April when this project was kind of first kicked off. I do think that creatively it's been really difficult to find inspiration. We're chained to our laptops right now.
Mhm.
We all are. So the last thing that some people can do, I certainly struggle to find inspiration to write. And when we had the remit of doing something about Brexit, I was like, well, we can't really write about the constitutional issues of Brexit, but we can write about the hostile immigration policy that the UK government have.
The real world impact that their policies have on us and on our communities.
Which has been pretty much progressed horrendously through Brexit. It seems to be the same sort of right-wing people who don't want different cultures, customs and traditions here. And I thought it was really, I never write, that's the thing, like this is the first ever co-write I've ever done, and I can't believe that it was on Zoom. And we're really lucky that we can use Zoom, because people in the global south don't have Zoom, they don't have internet, they don't have the devices that we are using, and we should always be really aware of our privilege, that we can work and make a living online. Like our entire last year has been managing to do things online, and that is amazing. But I found it really strange to try and write online, but I think I'd do it more.
Yeah, I would definitely do it more, especially for the initial collaborating process. I thought, you know, working together, putting together the lyrics that we did together was something that was really beneficial across Zoom, because it didn't involve us playing much music. It was more a discussion of ideas, of the things that we wanted to say within the music that we were creating. And a platform like Zoom is really good for something like that. It's not in any way, shape or form a replacement for the live setting of a performance, but it can be useful for musicians travelling different parts of the world with gigs in different areas of the country as well. It's very useful to keep in touch with our fellow artists and collaborators.
And I think that's something that Brexit is really going to impact. The fact that we can't go to Europe is not good, but the fact that we're also seeing less and less European musicians coming to perform to domestic UK audiences, that's not good either.
No.
Because if our domestic audiences can't be exposed to European artists and different cultures, traditions and customs, then we don't understand other people very well.
No. And it creates our own echo chamber. Where it's far too easy for the opinions of the far right to be able to kind of infect people and get in and around in these circles, and that ultimately is damaging for all kind of parts of the UK and all parts of society.
And I think that Little Britain, this insular island idea, is not good.
No.
But also not something that we voted for.
No.
And I'm sure back in 2014, should spin doctors not have told the people of Scotland, if you vote to leave the UK, you will leave Europe, I'm sure that the result would have been very different.
Oh, yeah,
because we were told, if you leave the UK, you're out of Europe, goodbye. And that scaremongered so many people into saying, okay, well, I'll just stay in the UK.
It got me, it definitely got me.
Yeah.
And this, especially with the promises that were laid out by both the Labour and Conservative parties of more devolved powers that really didn't touch on the issues that are current today here in Scotland, and now we are seeing this clash of cultures almost between Scotland that wants to be progressive and to move forward in the world, and in England and the rest of the UK that seems to be withdrawing back in on itself and becoming a far more insular place, like you say.
And I think that we discussed that themes in the song in Kenmure Street or Deportees very well, in the fact that Scotland can't do anything about these dawn raids. It's not a devolved matter. The border and our immigration policies are reserved to the UK, and our ministers that day were all in swearing-in ceremonies. They were all busy. Like Hamza Yousaf apparently couldn't get Priti Patel on the phone. There couldn't be a line. That, you know, this is the breakdown of communication between our devolved nations, which are supposed to be equal devolved nations, and I don't see that equality at all.
No, absolutely
And
not.
what concerns me is that Scotland is, yes, I guess we are, or I identify as a Scottish nationalist, but I also identify as being a European and an internationalist, and I think that Scotland is an internationalist country, and I think that the only way forward for Scotland to allow itself to be more progressive is through independence. But then there's so many unionists who say, oh, but look at the furlough scheme and the vaccination scheme and the self-employed income support scheme. That was all the UK government. That was the UK government because the UK borrowed money. Scotland doesn't have the power to borrow money. If Scotland had borrowing powers, we would have done that as well. We would have furloughed our own people. But we found again and again that Scotland was drawing at the purse strings of Westminster. You know, when England was coming out of a little bit of a lockdown and furlough was coming to an end last summer, Scotland's cases were rising and we had to beg, we need to go back on furlough. And only after England's cases started to rise again did the Chancellor, you know, reintroduce furlough.
Yeah.
It just shows that we are completely going in different ways. When you see on an electoral map, it's yellow.
It's all yellow
and blue.
Yeah.
And it shows very different nations. And I always feel like, as a folk singer, the content of my music is political in itself. So sometimes people are like, oh, why are you always so political? Why do you have to be? But the content of the songs, like, you know, I'll sing Freedom Come All Ye or Scotland Yet, or the content of the songs are nationalist in itself. But not the nationalist of British nationalism, the nationalism of we're Scotland, and if you come here, we'll treat you as a Scot. You can be a Scot, and that's what I love about Scotland, is that people can come here and make it their home and contribute to a society, just like the two men who were going to be detained and deported at Kenmure Street. They lived here for several years, working here and contributing to a part of a community. And I think that in Scotland that's a beautiful thing, and I don't think I see that much in England.
No, especially not. We really thrive as an inclusive country, and our culture and our economy thrives by being inclusive too.
But I do think that there has been like a compounded effect of Brexit and COVID.
Yes.
So
definitely.
COVID cancelled all the gigs, but then Brexit made them almost like we couldn't reschedule them. So yeah, it was like a domino effect, and I think that it is pretty grim. And it's grim that as the country went in and out of lockdowns, people found catharsis and solace, and they took comfort in music, in theatre, in art, yet the people who created that art are the people who are continually excluded from government support and are left behind and are not valued as people that create important art.
Exactly, yeah.
I don't know if that will change in a UK government. Oliver Dowden, the Culture Secretary of the UK, created a Spotify playlist. That was his response to the pandemic.
Oh wow, really? Gosh. that's pathetic, if anything.
Pathetic as anything. But yeah, maybe saying this, the whole fact that Brexit and the lack of touring isn't just an economic loss of, you know, us going over there and European musicians coming here, but it is a cultural loss. Part of being a musician is being able to go to a festival, do your gig, then have tunes after, especially in folk music, and being able to make connections and forge connections and be able to understand the similitudes and also the differences in your traditions. So, you know, tune players could go over to Ireland and find a tune that is completely, you know, different name, but it's the same tune. They can go to Scandinavia and find a tune that's went over there, but it's changed a little bit. There's this like connection between all of our folk cultures that it brings us all together, and I think that not being able to go to those festivals is really sad. One of my favourite gigs was in 2018. I went to a festival called Interceltic Festival de Lorient in Brittany, in France.
Nice.
And it was basically a Celtic festival. It's one of the biggest in the world, where it took people from, you know, Asturias, Galicia, you know, Cornwall, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, all of the Celtic nations and Celtic countries, and brought us all together under one huge festival. And you could dip into one tent and hear music from the Basque country, then you could go into another tent and hear Welsh songs and then Breton songs, and it was just amazing. And I really like worry for festivals like that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we've seen the decline of the festival scene within the UK itself. What with it looking like the coronavirus is staying around with us for a little bit longer. Festivals are now having to cancel, even in the wake of being told that we're going to get our Freedom Day coming up, and it's just more and more damage that's being done on these smaller festivals, especially. There's Kendall Collin that's now been cancelled as well, and we've lost many other ones, especially Electric Fields. We lost that a couple of years ago, and that's not looking like it's going to make any return whatsoever. What with the difficulties that they had to begin with, and then onto the pandemic crisis and Brexit as well. And so the UK festival scene is going to really suffer over the next few years, and I think the impact of it will not really be felt for the next couple of years. We will really see the decline of most music festivals soon, but hopefully with a self-determining Scotland and a progressive attitude towards these things, we can make a difference here in our own country.
And something that the Scottish Government has already done very successfully in the last couple of months is creating more funds and making more funds available for venue recovery grants. And we have to think about our grassroots venues, our small intimate venues, as well as our large concert halls. The large concert halls that the UK press called the crown jewels. Last year when they announced the arts package, a lot of that money went to places like the Royal Albert Hall that probably perhaps didn't need it as much as some other venues per se. But it just goes to show that when we are placing so much emphasis on sport, I'd like to see a little bit more test events with musicians other than Frank Turner. The Brit Awards could have been perceived as a test event, but with pre-recorded, pre-taped performances interspersed with poor humour, I don't think that was a test event.
No.
And just last month, the world looked to Rotterdam, that hosted the Eurovision Song Contest, all live with a capacity audience of 3,500, all going through stringent protocols, testing, lateral flow testing on the spot before being gained entry. All of the acts had to go through extreme COVID protocols, and it just showed that if a country cares enough about its culture, then it can put on a gig that's safe.
Yeah, it's remarkable that it's possible. And that's the worst thing I find, is that we look to these other countries and we see the progress being made, and we see the care and attention that they're applying, and that for us in the UK, that's such a bitter pill to swallow, to think that our government really doesn't care about what we do, and really just sees us as freeloaders and throws us in with the rest of the groups that they like to demonise, along with all the nationalities and ethnicities they demonise as well, as part of their hostile immigration policy, which we have been singing a lot about.
We have been speaking about.
Yes.
Yeah. Awesome. So I think this is a really great place to round up. It has been wonderful to take part in the Talk, Play, Collaborate series. I'm sure there's going to be many more to come as part of Dumfries Music Conference. Please do check us both out on social media with our respective bands.
Awesome.
Awesome.